World Insight coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program with Christine Lagarde. After leading the International Monetary Fund for 8 years, she has stepped down to become president of the European Central Bank. During her tenure with the IMF, China became the IMF's third largest shareholder behind only US and Japan, and China's currency has been included in the IMF special drawing rights basket. Her resignation also left the organization with major challenges, one of which is to keep peace between IMF's two most important member states, the United States and China. Take a look.
Amid a leadership scandal and the Eurozone crisis, the then French finance minister, Christine Lagarde, stepped into the global spotlight in 2011 as the 11th managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Skeptics questioned her lack of formal training in economics, while supporters praised her political skills that bring people across convictions to consensus. In the crowds of world leaders, Ms. Lagarde often stands out as the first female head of the IMF and became the most well-known spokesperson for the fund. Under her leadership in 2016, the IMF added the Chinese renminbi to the basket of currencies that make up the special drawing right, elevating the yuan's international status. As Ms. Lagarde moves on to the head of the European Central Bank, her poised successor, Kristalina Georgieva, will not only inherit her legacy, but also her challenges. Multilateral bodies such as the IMF are under greater scrutiny. However, most pressingly, the IMF is concerned with a predicted global economic slowdown.
A so-called trade war, driven by reciprocal increases in import tariff, gives no winner. And we find generally losers on both sides.
As the ongoing trade conflict between the world's two largest economies drags on, the world's last resort lender is facing increasing pressure.
For more on the future of the IMF, I'm joined in London Professor Ian Begg, a research fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Political Science. And in New York, we have Max Wolf, managing partner at Multivariate. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Professor Wolf, I would like to go to you first about the future of the IMF with the change of person as the managing director. What do you say? There will be directional change, or likely there's going to be a continuous path from the earlier approach?
So I think we're going to see a lot of similar approach, but I do think it's a milestone and a good one that we have somebody in charge of an organization that primarily is tasked with helping the economic development of developing countries, which for the first time is a person who's from a developing country, not a war-ravaged developed country or a wealthy developed country, but a developing country. And I also think it's pretty interesting to have somebody who was trained outside of the usual universities, which is also a first. The few American or European universities that have trained almost everyone who's been in charge of a Bretton Woods institution. And I also think it's a good hopeful sign to see that we have someone who has studied and who has taught both in the US and China, as the various frictions between those two largest shareholders have been more than a little bit problematic from a global economic development perspective in the last little while.
Right. Professor Begg, of course, Ms. Georgieva is one coming from a developing economy, but at the same time, she's been having a lot of experience with the World Bank, particularly on development issues and on issues like climate change. So what do you think there might be some of the earlier experiences carried over to the current post, while at the same time, certainly as managing director of IMF, there are special qualities that the leader should have of this organization?
Well, I think I'd reinforce what you've just been told, that she is a breath of fresh air. I've met her a couple of times, and she's a very charismatic woman. Her background, not just in the World Bank, but also in her time at the European Commission, ranged across various economic development portfolios, but she was also at one stage the European Commissioner for a budget, so she knows how to control money as well as the priorities inside trying to foster economic development. Now, yes, the world is moving towards a green agenda. It follows that the IMF is going to have to follow that as well, and therefore thinking about green finance, thinking about new ways of innovating to try to get a more climate-friendly approach. That's bound to be part of the IMF's next stages of development.
Right. Now, Professor Wolf, Ms. Lagarde, the earlier managing director of IMF, was quite well known throughout her tenure as someone who's daring to speak out against even some of the very strong economies and members of the IMF, to say the least. Now, what do you make of her approach? Is that unique among all managing directors of IMF? Are we going to see that also reflected through the future generations of IMF and managing directors at a time of dramatic change we have witnessed in the world, Professor?
Yes, so I do think we're going to see that. I think that the new candidate in Georgieva is probably quite promising in that regard. I think that the IMF has gone through a crisis. I wouldn't lay it at the feet of either of these women, but has gone through a bit of a crisis of relevance and legitimacy. In the best of times, the world is awash with inexpensive credit, and that makes the role of the IMF somewhat less obvious to some folks around the world who need to believe in it in all market conditions. And then when the markets get really tight, there's been a proclivity of the IMF to be very doctrinaire and orthodox in the economic advice, and also to be an easy target of blame for various governments around the world. So the IMF needs to show it is more sensitive to realities on the ground and more relevant to the concerns of the people, the vast majority of the world's population, that is dealing with the crises, economic and climatic, to be honest, in a developing world context. And I think we're going to have to see a little bit more strident of a voice, and I do think that we probably have someone in the new director here who is very promising in that regard.
Professor Beck, though, if you look at Ms. Georgieva's past record, one could certainly notice some kinds of bravery in terms of pushing the right policy at the right places. However, if you think about the challenges she and the IMF is facing right now, there was an earlier transition from US dollar to a basket of currency that the IMF would embrace as the major currencies around the world. Of course, during the earlier tenure of Ms. Lagarde, some of the developing countries, China's, for example, voting rights has been improved, or improved at least to a certain percentage. But there are still a lot of things undone yet, particularly at a time of great transition. Professor Beck, how much change can this generation of managing director of IMF still have the room to push?
Well, I think it's an incremental process. Change at the big institutions like the IMF only happens relatively slowly, because you also have to remember that those countries such as, let's say, Belgium and Europe, which have a disproportionate voting weight, are going to be very reluctant to lose it. So you have to massage their feelings and egos at the same time as you try to promote the emerging countries, which naturally expect that they should have bigger amounts. But there's also the day-to-day business of the IMF. It has to think about the problems it's facing with potentially a slowing global economy. The IMF has been warning about that now for some time. The fact that there are some countries which are recurrent difficulties for them, not least Argentina now very much back at the top of the agenda. How to deal with countries which ought to be doing better, like Argentina, if you can't impose the kind of conditions that the IMF has traditionally imposed. These are delicate questions of governance that only evolve relatively slowly.
Yeah. If you think about what's going on right now, particularly the relationship, Professor Wolf, since you are based in the U.S. right now, between China and the United States. Now, two important economies certainly in the world, and important members as well of the IMF, are not on necessarily good terms, and not to mention the geopolitics on a bigger scale. So one would assume that the managing director of IMF would have a lot of struggles and challenges in front of her in order to bring everybody online.
So absolutely. I mean, this is a uniquely difficult moment to have the responsibility and the opportunity of being in charge of the IMF. I mean, I think we all kind of realize that some of the traditional safeguards around freedom of trade and freedom of economic commerce around the world and advocates for globalization particularly voices inside the United States and to some degree inside Europe and the United Kingdom particularly, have gone from proponents to opponents of free trade in a moment where we sit pretty near what could be a global growth recession. And the combination of a growth recession and a hardening and hostility to the world and growing nationalism, along with climate change, probably are the three great threats that you encounter in this job. And it's nearly certain that very quickly in the tenure she will encounter various combinations, hopefully non-lethal, but various combinations of those challenges to her ruling, her leadership, and also just to the organization and the Bretton Woods system writ large, including but not limited to the IMF.
Now, China's economy slowed down, but it's still the largest and one of the largest and also fastest developing economies, driving force of the global economy. But the U.S. economy also likely to slow down, unlike the earlier, Professor Begg, prediction of the IMF suggesting more than 3.6%. Now it's probably only 2%. So what does it say to a global slowdown, which the managing director of IMF should consider and put out proposals related to that? Professor Begg, briefly.
Well, unfortunately, only for the major economies like China and the US, the same really applies to the European Union. The IMF can only advise, cajole, and try to persuade. It doesn't have the instruments to reboot the American economy or the Chinese economy. That's down, in the US case, to the combination of the Fed and the US Treasury. So it's about persuasion, but also looking where there might be damage going on in the rest of the world and being ready to intervene if, let's say, without being unreasonable, Brazil gets into difficulty because of some complications going on there, or somewhere in Africa has difficulties, or Southeast Asia. These are the areas where the IMF is expected to intervene. Or Brexit,
or Brexit.
Well, no, I just don't see the IMF being part of the response to Brexit. I thought we were going to avoid that topic today for once, but you insisted.
It's all entangled, I'm afraid. And gentlemen, last year I did have the opportunity to talk to Kristalina Georgieva when she was still serving in the World Bank. Let's listen in to what she had to say, an excerpt of our earlier discussion. There's so much debate about whether the existing system is still functioning or not. There's so much debate about whether we still need the multilateralism. Maybe we should just go our countries first. There's so much debate about, is still World Bank relevant today? What do you think?
Well, let me make 3 points. One, our shareholders voted with their checkbooks on whether the World Bank is relevant or not. We just got the highest in our history capital increase, 50% boost of our financial capacity. Second, the problems we face today and we will be facing tomorrow, climate change, the health of our oceans, our ability as a world community to live sustainably, none of these problems individual countries can solve on their own. Trading in a fair manner, we cannot do that as individual countries. Therefore, cooperation is a must. In this ocean we swim today, we are all in the same boat. And it is impossible to turn to you and say, you know what, your end of the boat is sinking, but I'm just fine. Interdependence calls for cooperation, and cooperation makes everybody better off.
So obviously, gentlemen, you could tell from her earlier answer to my questions, she puts in a lot of emphasis on gender equity, climate change issues, the ocean, and some of the public goods issues when she was serving at the World Bank. Will those issues, from what angle the IMF could better in a way, provide answers to. What do you think, Professor Wolf?
Yes, so I think the IMF has shown a pretty rapid maturation in the sophistication in which it deals with those issues lately. But I think we've had a long period, in which the IMF was somewhat doctrinaire in the notion that growth was really the job. All growth would be pro-poor growth. All growth would be equity enhancing across ethnic, religious, and gender divisions. And I think we've found that that's quite rarely the case. So it's exciting when that occurs. It does occur sometimes, but it's probably the exception as opposed to the rule. And so I think being sensitive to the fact that one of the major exogenous shocks that economies may face will be climactic, and we've already seen that, and we're going to see more of it. And that growth alone, without some distributional consciousness, is probably the wrong medicine for the ailments of the 21st century.
Well said. Professor Begg, your thoughts?
Inequality is going to be one of the main big topics for international governance. I think that we've seen that from all kinds of angles. Second, I would say that Kristalina will have to work closely with the other institutions, and it's a great advantage to her, having been across the road in Washington at the World Bank previously to joining the IMF. And at the same time, the IMF itself, which is predominantly an organ to deal with macroeconomic issues, has to be aware of how it imposes its conditionality on countries in ways which could be adverse for growth, adverse for equality, and adverse for the kind of gender mainstreaming that she would like to see in her new portfolio. So these are just three of the big headings that she will have to confront.
I see. Ian Begg, Max Wolf, what a pleasure. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us.